So cutting the triangles, all it is, let me get my note down. So here's again, you have, you know, a 3x3, and you're really just cutting it in half, like cutting the diagonal. So like here's one. Okay, let's get this one out of the way. So this was my square, and you're just gonna cut it in half. Actually, it's easier to see right there. So what, like for me, this design was very particular. Like I had to figure out, do I want to cut it this way, or did I want to cut it going this way? So if you don't care, it's really just cutting it, you know, because you're going to be turning them. Like with my example here, you know, my red and my yellow, one's going to go above and one's going to go below. So even though these are two of the from the same piece, you know, it's going to slowly like flip flop. You know, these can go either way. Ooh, that kind of looks good together. Ugh, that little one. So yeah, you're literally just cutting it in half and then sewing along the diagonal. So I haven't started this row at all yet. I sewed one together. I sewed one yesterday. But what I do again is I'll get all of the diagonal ones done because it's diagonal, just an orange square, diagonal. So I'll get all of these done and ready. Then I'll start doing what the rest of the class is doing, where I'm slowly adding square to square. And also for those of you that have, let's say for instance, with my sketch, so I have two diagonals that I turned back into squares. So I'm going to sew those together right now. But my third one is just a square. It's not a diagonal, it's just an orange square. I have a video. If you need to see how to sew like a diagonal to a square, I already have that video up. Right now, I'm going to show you how to sew two diagonals together. So pretty much we cut these in half, right? Cut them in half. I just sewed it back together. Where are my other pieces? Kind of like this, because I have to do this other side too. So I have these two separate ones. And again, this whole, the quilt is always just squares. Like unless you're doing the Lakota star, that's all diamonds. But for us, it's mostly just squares. And so we cut the right triangles, but we're turning them back into squares. Like that's what these are. They were triangles, now they're square shapes again. And someone had asked, I think it was second period, I forget. They're like, well, how do I kind of cut my fabric? It depends. If you have just a regular color, like there's no pattern, it doesn't really matter. You're really just cutting it straight in half. You know, for my red ones, that one I had to kind of plan. I had to see like if I cut it like this, do I like how the rest of that pattern looks? Or would I rather cut it this way? So that one I kind of had to like mess with and like my brain kind of hot wired a little bit because I was like, I don't know. But I figured it out. So I have yellow, red, because again, my first square is this half C diagonal one. And then red, yellow. Yeah, I don't think I want to do it. Yeah, the only thing with the half C's is figuring out how you want it to look. No, I think I want it the other way. Yeah, I'm gonna do this. So as with everything, every time we sew, we really just look at the squares we're working with. The one on the right, I'm just going to flip it over again to the left because I gotta sew where those two are gonna touch. But with diagonals, what you have to realize, let me see if I can show you better on this black piece. When I have the square, I have these extra little tails that I don't need, and they're gonna get hidden. No one's gonna see them in the quilt, but they could be distracting. So you just gotta be mindful of that. Like, okay, I have to pretend like those don't exist. If you haven't sewn to the edge, so for instance, here's my ugly fly knot. I could trim this, like cut it with scissors. So that way I don't think about it. I never do because I always worry about cutting my stitches and then starting over again and then wanting to scrape. So I always just ignore it. If you find that your fabric's really thick and it keeps wanting to do this, it won't like stay down in the square, ironing helps. I didn't do it, but you can always iron these guys after you're done sewing them back together. But you want to make sure you ignore those pieces. So when I flip this to the first square, I really just want to line these guys up. I can't think about those little edges because they don't exist. They don't matter. Again, I'm not the best person to cut fabric, so I'm just kind of double checking, like how does the yellow look? Making sure those kind of line up. And mine are going to be a little off. So you see how you can see some of that red and some of that yellow is a little off. Okay, so I'm ignoring those ends. I'm trying to line this up as best I can. Okay. And I have some spillover, like you can just see my yellow, kind of. It's not exactly lined up, just like my red, but it's as even as I can get it. That's kind of the struggle when you do the diagonals. As even as you can get it. One nice thing is that when we sew the rows together, you can kind of hide a lot of this unevenness. But I always try as best I can. Now, for me, holding this in place is torture. Like I can try, but it's like, why make life harder? So I'm just going to grab my paper clip or my bobby pins over there. I got it fairly even. I kind of like push the little flaps down so that way they're not sticking up. I'm going to do a paper clip and a bobby pin. Not too bad. Okay, so it's holding, like it's doing most of the work for me of holding the fabric together. I don't want to have to like struggle with that. So now I can just sew. So I had the two, I took the second one, I flipped it. Because they're diagonal, it gets a little like, you got to check and just trying to get them as straight as possible. Don't remember you're going to sew here, not on these little tips. Like don't let those fool you. So what I'm hoping to try to do, because there's this little gully, is when I do my needle through, again, I don't want to go super close to the edge. I'm going to kind of get near that blue stitch right here, but as low as I can go. So I'm going to try to get like right on that blue stitch for my first one. And then now it's the same thing, just running stitch all the way up. Okay. I don't give myself a guide. I tend to sew like super close to the edge and then I get angry later on. That's pretty good. Okay. And this is, again, this is always gonna be the same thing. No, that's why we did the template last week, because the paper is just a sketch. Think of it like a map. If you have a map of downtown LA, that's not actually the size of downtown LA, it's just a map. So our size paper is just a sketch, it's just to guide us when we get started. So that way we know what square is coming up next. Because when we're like 4 rows in, you don't think about the pattern anymore. So if you just think about that one row, this sketch helps you kind of remember, oh, okay, I need an orange square now. So just like before, when we get to the top, we just got to go back down. I'm doing 2 rows of that running stitch just to make sure. Sometimes like to pull out a knot, I'll like pull, and it's always going to wrinkle my fabric. So I'll like stretch it back again because you don't want it to be wrinkled. Okay. I always like with diagonals, I always just like to check like how close, like is it going to come apart down there? Because that's what I don't want. I don't want it to come apart. Well, maybe I'll do like, if I can do one more stitch right down here. Okay, so I have 2 options to end it. I can go to this blue stitch, I can go to that green stitch. Again, doesn't matter. I just gotta, find one. Slide my needle underneath if I can. There we go. Now this is like, as you can see, I have to put my needle through this little loop. Because I try to sew as much as possible, I can like just turn my needle around to get it into this loop. Just be careful, like you gotta pick your poison. Either start and stop and be frustrated by that, or be frustrated by not being able to make this knot, and then this will all come undone if you don't make a knot. So it's kind of like, ugh. Always one part to be frustrated about. Okay, so there is my first one, first and second square. Now I'm going to sew on that orange square. And it's going to be the same thing. Again, I'm going to ignore the first square because it doesn't matter anymore. And I'm just going to flip this one onto the second. Again, these little tails don't matter either. I want to line up the orange just to the yellow and that little bit of red, a little bit of that other fabric that's poking out. That's the fabric I care about. Get my needle ready. Okay, so again, my third square, flipping it over. I'm going to draw a line so I don't forget. And you don't have to use two things to hold your fabric together. I like to because my hands always get a little crazy. Okay. Again, starting not too close to the bottom. So here, don't forget, it becomes a little tricky because I have that little flap and I need to sew on that yellow. So I need to kind of ignore that flap. I'm going to do a diagonal. Can't get too close either. Tricky, tricky. Yeah, that's good enough. Same thing, slide underneath the stitch, do the loop, do it again. Underneath, do the loop. And I always get new threads. Like even though I have like a good amount left on this needle, to start the next one, I'll just get more. Like don't try to push it because making that knot is gonna be the killer. Okay, so I'm slowly building this row. You know, I haven't done these diagonals yet, so I have to wait, I have to pause because I have to sew these back together, right? I have to turn them back into their square. So that's going to take me a little bit of time. But sewing the diagonals to the squares isn't hard. It's really just remembering not to pay attention to those little ends. and to just line it up to the parts that need to be lined up. So those edges.